Alright, so the next one we're going to talk about is Robert Zemeckis' The Polar Express, which, when you look at the other movies we've talked about and are going to talk about, seems a lot newer when you give it basically brand it with the classic status being, I think, 2004 is when it came out. And I remembered when it initially came out, I didn't have a whole lot of interest in it. And it wasn't until later, like on its DVD release, that I finally saw it, and it was like I immediately wished that I had seen it in a theater. And they actually do play it here, like once every year around this time of year, but I never end up making it. So I am hoping to eventually do that because I do think it is absolutely a full blown classic, which sometimes I say with caution because there are a lot of people that feel that way, and this isn't really that important because all that really matters is your own opinion. But just as kind of a curious thing, I have noticed that I never quite know where this movie's current reputation lies. Because there are a lot of people that, like me, consider it like a full-on classic. But then I know that there's others that don't really care much for it at all, and they think it's a bit too creepy, and the animation is kind of off, and you can still see it was like kind of in the early stages of this whole idea of a movie being entirely um, motion capture and all that. And it was, Zemeckis kind of almost experimenting at the time. After he'd had so much success with visual effects in the past, like with Back to the Future and Forrest Gump even. But here, it was like, at the time, was like a whole other level. And I can get, where some people have a problem with, like, particularly the other kids on the train, where it's like, they have their, freaky looking faces and all that. And I get why that, can put people off. But I also feel like that's such a minute detail when you see just the enormous, incredible spectacle that the entire movie is as a whole. That it just kind of keeps throwing at you nonstop. Even this opening scene alone, where obviously this is based on the Chris Van Allsburg book, which I don't recall specifically that I ever actually read, but I did always see the cover in the school library, which, interestingly enough, makes me nostalgic enough to where even if I didn't read it, but there's also the idea of the nostalgia factor, which obviously a lot of people use as a weapon against movies and say it's the only reason they like movies or whatever. But when you're like trying to recreate something like the opening of this movie does, where it's obviously it's the whole thing about the kid is losing his faith and saying all that, and he's seeing all the different clues around. There's something, just the feel of this scene alone, before the train even gets there. Everything happening in the house so quietly, and then him and his sister going to bed and all that. There's... the opening of this movie has always made me so incredibly nostalgic towards, like, the Christmas Eve when I was a kid. And it's like, even if it's not like, I didn't even have a sister, but it's still sort of the same. I guess just having a sibling helps. But yeah, and it just captures just that feeling alone before anything, even like any actual magic has happened in the movie. To the point that the whole, not just really that, but the whole arrival of the train itself just feels so dreamlike, to the point that one of the things I've always loved about the movie is, obviously, there's things towards the end that confirm this, but for most of the movie, it's kind of ambiguous about whether or not he's dreaming, to the point that it kind of keeps pointing in that direction. Like, he keeps acknowledging that he's probably dreaming, and the fact that the movie continuously makes it feel like that is sort of I said, just that sort of vibe that it has that really captures a certain, like, just the momentum of the whole thing works on that feeling alone as it goes on, regardless of how big it gets. Whether it be the small moments or the big sort of more action-y scenes, it never loses that feel and stays consistent throughout, for the most part, most of the time. And the way that opening scene is shot alone, where you get these really creative shots, like the whole keyhole thing, or when he's, I'm not even sure how to describe this, but obviously people have seen the movie, when he's looking at the book or the magazine or whatever, and we're looking like out at him from behind the words, and it's like, what director would think of that? And we get a couple of shots like that. There's also the shot through the ice when he picks up the bell at the end, when the only other thing on the other side of the ice is ground, but it's still like this perfect shot. And just taking moments like that aren't, you know, the big action things, and doing things that visually stunning with them, is where a lot of that magic's going to come from also. And another part of that, as far as like the sort of dreamlike nature of it, but also the real feeling of like the child in wonder or confusion or whatever. Because that's the thing. The way when I say confusion, that could really go either way. But you would think sort of negative and like off-putting, and that is in there. But surely by the feel of it, it's intentional, because this character of the conductor that Hanks plays, one of the millions of characters he plays in this, where he does the motion capture for like most of them. He's like, Hanks is even doing the motion capture for the kid, despite Daryl Sabara providing his voice. And he does that for a lot of the characters. I think Peter Scolari and Michael Jeter are in there also. As Peter Scolari's the lonely kid, and Michael Jeter's like the train people. But then pretty much everybody else that does voices, like Eddie Deezen, do their both, the recognizable people. And the thing about this conductor is that he still has, yes, he may have, you know, an off-putting face because that's just the way the animation is, but you can still tell that it's Hanks through his appearance and his voice. And there is that sort of inherent warmth that Hanks has, hence the brilliance of his casting as so many characters in this, and the fact that it's a Zemeckis movie also. With him collaborating again with him after Forrest Gump and Castaway and then this. But the thing about the conductor is there's also, like, an intimidation factor to him. Whereas, like, sometimes he can be funny, like his little clock that tells him whether he's late or not, and he's just constantly late. There's the whole thing when the train pulls up and he gives the hero kid the whole spiel that he goes through, and then when they pick up the lonely kid, we hear him in the distance going through the exact same motions. There's something funny about that. But then, there are the moments where, like, they go to take the hot chocolate to the lonely kid who's in another car, and it's like this sort of dooming moment when he comes up behind them like they've been caught. And it's like there's something so ominous about him then. And it's like, and then when he takes her away, and it's like he's basically rewarding her, but it looks really, really sinister in the moment. We get like a whole action scene based on this miscommunication. But at the same time, it feels like, especially when he like just kind of walks up on them in that moment, it feels like the perfect representation of like basically that childlike fear of adults. And by that I mean like the fear of being in trouble when you're a kid. And it's like, I feel like that's really what Zemeckis was going for when there are certain aspects of this movie to where it's like, he's in this, you know, magical, wonderful new land with this train and then onward, but there's always going to be like the scary stuff in there. Like, I've heard comparisons to The Wizard of Oz, where it's like when you see, you know, Dorothy thrown away into this place where there's like so much magic in it, and like so much stuff that you could say like, you know, maybe she should stay here, maybe she shouldn't even go back to Kansas. But then you've got stuff like the Wicked Witch and the Flying Monkeys and the forest and all that. And it's like there's always going to be those scary elements, being basically a kid with a bunch of, you know, the people you're there with that are on this journey with you are just as much of a stranger as the land itself to you. So there's just going to be a natural element there of like discomfort and uncertainty. And I think that comes through a lot, especially with the other character. Obviously there's plenty, like the dad and the Santa and all that. But the other character where you can really, really tell it's Hanks is the homeless ghost that's on top of the train. And that's also where it's like he's harmlessly eerie. Like, he comes off like a ghost story that you would tell a child that's not too terrifying. He always reminds me of the last scene of the Haunted Train episode of Hey Arnold. I don't know how many people know what I'm talking about, but that's what I always think of also. And so yeah, that I think that feeling throughout, to where it's like an intentional eeriness, but just enough to where it's not overboard. Maybe it gets a little bit there in the scene with like the marionettes and the dead toys and all that. But that's still like it's maintaining that vibe, and then all the way through. So also talking about the other kids there and basically them all being strangers to each other. What's interesting about that, and less off-putting than it probably could be in lesser hands, is the fact that you kind of get this, like, we don't go into those other kids. We focus on the hero boy, the hero girl, the lonely kid, and the know-it-all kid. And everybody else is just background noise. Like, they could be anybody. But the thing about that is that there's still enough about those characters we never go into. We hardly even see their faces. That gives you the idea that, like, all these kids are on their own individual journey. And, like, all these kids have gone through the same period of the hero kid, where it's like, you know, well, maybe Santa's not real, and the way this thing connects to this thing makes too much sense for this to not be a fictional character. And you also get that one of the main things I always thought gave me that vibe was not, I was talking about the conductor has to go through the spiel every single time and it's the same one for every kid, but also the fact that when they get on the train, those kids are singing that Polar Express song. And it's like, we don't know how long they've been on this train, or what they heard prior to this. And it's like, how do they know that Polar Express song? It's creepy. But then we get the moment where the hot chocolate guys come out and there's a whole musical number. These waiters that just materialize, we never see them again or know where they come from. And they have this whole number and they sing this hot chocolate song. And then in the next scene, when they're talking about, the main character's talking about whatever, you can hear the kids in the background singing the hot chocolate song now. So it's like, oh, so before the hero kid got on the train, there was probably some big Polar Express number that had that song. And it's just like an ongoing thing. And so that, and I think that enough establishes, like, so all these kids have been on the same journey, just at different points, depending on when you were picked up. I think one of them even says to the hero kid, I thought you were the last kid, when they pick up the lonely kid. So this, obviously the train has been going for most of the night at this point. And so I like the way that's handled without it having to do too much to establish that. And there are some cases where I think, especially with the dream aspect, where sometimes I think maybe if it were more majorly from the kid's perspective, it would have kind of more of that outlook to it, and that whole dreamlike nature would come through a little better. But then I remember there's some really good individual scenes that aren't necessarily, the kid isn't necessarily present for. Like, the whole ticket thing is amazing, and probably always will be my favorite scene in the movie. When he's trying to take the hero girl her ticket, and it flies out the window, and we follow it on this magnificent journey that it takes over a waterfall, into a bird's nest, it's flying around with walls, and this just ultimately somehow finds its way back to the train. Could be its own short film. That's really incredible. And it's like I said, there's just something about that scene alone that I would never remove from this, regardless of whose perspective you want to tell it through. And then there's also the stuff with, like, the train workers. And it's like, even though those, I don't think those characters have to be here, and it does make you wonder, like, who they are, and how they, as far as, like, who lives at the North Pole and all that, and what kind of different people do. I also raised the question of what the conductor is, if not a, whether it's a what or a who, it's hard to say. But then there is, you know, those scenes, like when he takes out the hairpin, is a scene that's so funny to me. It's like, no, I wouldn't take that out. So, all of that works also, even when you're bringing other characters into it, and regardless of how long or short that they're here. And I do think, if there's one problem I do have with the movie, I do think there is a pace issue, and that is solely because what's great about the movie for a long time, for the entire first half, is how non-stop it feels, because You've got, the hot chocolate number, then you've got the scene where we follow the ticket around, then you've got the scene where they're on top of the train and they do the skiing thing, then you have where they have to try to stop the train before, the caribou scene, and then there's the moment where it's like a roller coaster, which we get a couple of times, but this one in particular, this first time, and then when, the track is covered in ice and they have to go over that. All of that stuff happens like one right after the other, and it is like non-stop. It feels non-stop. And then we get to the North Pole, not before we had a song, which is the probably second most useless song shoehorned into a Christmas movie after Cindy Lou's song in The Grinch. Uh, and it's people just desperately wanting that Oscar nomination for original song. That's all it is. But then they get to the North Pole, and the reason I think this kind of causes a pacing issue is that it does a really good job of convincing you that this is the big moment, this is what we've been waiting for, this is what we've been waiting to see, is them getting to the North Pole, and it feels very climatic. And I don't wonder how many people realize it's only halfway through the movie when we get to the North Pole. That everything that happens at the North Pole is the entire second half of the movie, and with the non-stop feel we had on the train, and the fact that the movie is called The Polar Express, that's like, that can definitely cause a pacing issue, and it does feel a bit contrived the more they get involved in stuff like the kid not watching his step when he climbs onto the train and he hits the brake thing and the train goes. It's like, just that kid not watching his step doubled this movie's runtime. And then it's like, and they keep following the lonely kid who wants his present, and it's like, once again, this movie could cut its runtime in half if they didn't give a crap about that kid. But they are the hero boy and the hero girl, as their character names are called, so it's in their nature to go after the lonely kid and make sure he doesn't kill himself trying to get his present that he will have in the morning. So, but there's also that whole emotional factor there where we learn it's like, Christmas has not gone well for that kid for most of his life, so this is like the really big deal. So they do give it like a reason he goes after that present, but I can also see it being convoluted to some people, especially if they see it as a pacing issue. But yeah, and then once we have a lot of stuff, we have the whole, spiral thing when they go down to the presents, we have all the elves and all that. They throw a couple of action scenes in there also, but then when they finally get back into the center of things, it is kind of cool that the movie just becomes such a celebration. There's just like a straight 15 minutes of just the elves celebrating. And once again, they do throw some convoluted stuff in there, like knocking the star off the tree, and then all they have to do is fling it back up there, apparently. And so there's stuff like that. I will never approve of the Steven Tyler elf. I don't know what the hell they were thinking with that. But, even so, this whole scene where, like I said, it's just where, Santa arrives and all that, and they bring out the reindeer, and it's really great stuff. It's, like I said, it's kind of in quick succession, individual moments too, like we were talking about before. So it all eventually works itself out, even if there's like a middle portion there where it's like, I feel like they could, cut this down a little bit. But it all eventually comes together and just works in really big ways. Another one of the visuals I forgot to mention is them going up the mountain. Has always been a fantastic shot. It's like the shot they always use in like promotional material for it also, and then it's got the bridge on the other side, just at the top. Amazing, incredible visuals, and like I said, even if there's stuff like the faces that don't, age well as far as technology and how much better that'd probably look if it was now, it's still, the magic is definitely there, and like just the overall vision of it, and the way they sort of depict the spirit of Christmas and all that really works. So, and then the final stuff, the final lines are just really the whole thing about the bell, and then him going through old age, and like everybody stopped hearing the bell except for him. That's beautiful. and it hits every single time. So that's pretty much how I feel about this movie. I think that's everything. So I think I'm gonna do about like 4 more of these, and then we will, and that'll be it. And then we'll probably be into all the award stuff for the next couple of months, and the big video coming Friday. So yeah, so until all of that stuff, I think that's it for this.